How you guys doing?
Good. I'm interested in your opinion of the Coast to Coast Atlantic Coast Conference.
Wow. Big picture, huh? For me, given that one of the biggest arguments my dad and I ever had as a kid was going from 9 to 12, 12 to 17 seems like a pretty easy lift. I guess it was bound to happen. It was just who was going to be on the roster. Felt like the realignment thing, the Oklahoma-Texas thing to the SEC kind of pushed it, and then the Big 12 acquisition of those Pac-12 schools, and then, without knowing a lot of the inside stuff on how, I know Notre Dame was really interested in helping Stanford as much as they could from some of the things I've read. Cal and Stanford do have quite an alignment, I've come to find out, and talking to folks out there, not just as universities, but as athletic programs. And then, look, I felt like, and I know Rick Hart, the athletic director at SMU, his grandfather was the former commissioner of the Southern Conference when I was at Marshall 30 years ago. I know his dad, obviously, very well, who was the AD at Florida State for years. Rick is a tremendous athletic administrator, and I've had some friends in the past that have worked at SMU. And it's just been a matter of time and place before SMU wanted to have an opportunity. And when you're going to give 7 years of television money back, right? I mean, you're probably going to lean in on that. And that's a marketplace I think TCU has shown, and certainly Texas and Texas A&M dominate that marketplace at times. But I think TCU has shown, and SMU has shown 40 years ago, that if you are successful and you win, a lot of people will buy in. I think SMU is going to come in the league, and some of the stats on their season football tickets and the money they've raised are pretty impressive. So, let's buckle up and see how it works. I think it's an interesting time to go to 17 with the expansion of the playoff. I think the preseason poll is a little bit of a reflection of that, where 8 different teams got first place votes. I think this league could be a real factor in the college football playoff. When we were in Charlotte, I had 5 or 6 teams who I felt like had a path to the playoff or potentially to the ACC championship game. Now that we've been around and I've only done a couple of these, this is my second of 3 of the road trips, I feel like that depth is starting to be realized across the board. Now, how it plays out in the first month, I think is going to kind of tell us where the rest of the year goes.
You mentioned, obviously, some of the teams that you can see making a run towards the playoff, but obviously, with the way SEC and Big Ten has positioned itself, do you think the ACC is in a good spot right now with the teams they've added?
Yeah, because the AP poll doesn't count. That's the thing you always have to remember. They turn this thing loose, and look, I have no problem with people that vote for the AP poll. But that poll does not matter. It's a bar to which we put out there in August, but it's great, but it's irrelevant. And we're going to hang numbers by those teams, and we got 4 in the ACC, I think, in the top 25, if I recall correctly. So we got 4 of the top 25, and now you're thinking, okay, well, that's the gospel. That's not the gospel at this point. And again, Ralph Russo and the people at the Associated Press, terrific people. But the poll doesn't mean anything when that committee sits in that room for the first time in Grapevine, Texas. Are they influenced by that poll? According to the bylaws, no. They come at it, in a different process, the mock process I've been through years ago. You see how they group teams and eventually get to the 25 when they start releasing the CFP poll. But yeah, I do think that, first of all, we've expanded it, right? And so now, where it used to be 0 and 1, and when you got beyond 1, you didn't feel real good about your chances. Now all of a sudden, 1 and 2 are still in the hunt. Well, you start looking at the ACC. I mean, they're teams that you can say, wait a second, they might be undefeated, or might only have 1 loss, or might only have 2 losses. Those teams, to me, are going to be alive. We don't have any idea how this is going to work. I mean, we think we do, but I run into people who still don't understand that the 4 conference champions are the top 4 seeds. And so until we see it one time for sure, and maybe a couple times, I think we don't have a real grasp of how many teams are actually going to stay in contention until the very end. And I think that's important for a league like the ACC to remember, because the depth in the league right now is as good as it's ever been. And that's easy because you look at the number of teams, but in reality, I mean, there are 8, we just said it in finishing up one of our segments. I think we're still looking at the potential of 8 or 9 teams who could, be factors in this into November. And it's funny for me, my blessing to do the NFL for so many years now in Atlanta, it's amazing how impactful those games get as the year goes. And I think that's what the ACC has to play for. is find ways to get your impactful games in the month of November going down the stretch. And Pitt saw that a few times. I mean, they've seen it here recently as well. So I think that's going to be a big part of this that we just haven't counted on yet.
You think it's smart to have the top four, the two conference champions be the top four, and maybe the second place team in the Big Ten as an argument?
I think the way the top four seeds are going to work is the conference champion is going to be the automatic. My understanding is those four teams are going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4 in some order. And then the highest rated G5 gets plugged in where they finish in the poll. Okay, and so then the second place team could be 5, 6, 7. I mean, it's quite possible that you could have a conference on conference matchup, you know, in the early rounds. I mean, the days you and I were familiar with the 4 team and the old BCS is they tried to stay away from those conference on conference games. Now that's not going to be possible. And remember too, you're going to campus sites in that first round. That's a big change too. And I think that's something that, again, we don't know what that's going to look like. I mean, we think we do. It'll be great, but we haven't seen it yet. And, you know, just having seen the NFL go through their, you know, kind of the revision they made in the playoffs a year ago, I think you saw a lot of interesting games take place. And imagine now we're expanding this thing 3 times. We've gone from 4 to 12. It's not like we went 4 to 8. We just went ahead and burrowed to 12 and already talking about more. So I think that part is going to be fascinating to watch. I really do.
You were just asking about
Hang on real quick. Yes, sir.
yeah, you were just asked about the newcomers, you know, Cal and Stanford, but about 12 years ago, this program was a newcomer.
Yeah.
What do you think how has Pitt kind of fit into the ACC landscape?
I would say in terms of football, in a big way. I mean, they went through a little bit of cycling with coaches, right? And then when Paul Chris left, you saw them make what I thought was a terrific hire. And better than that, they also gave Pat the patience to build this thing to where there's a degree of continuity. And that's why, you know, I come away from this thinking the first 4 games are going to be pretty important for Pitt. You know, continuity at quarterback is going to be really important. The emergence of the defense, you know, you've seen some names on there. You know how the transfers probably factor into it from watching the spring. But now, how does it look when they get on the field and start playing week after week, right? I think Pitt, and a lot of credit goes to Heather with her leadership since coming on here. I know Pat was hired by the previous administration. And I think Heather's understood that patience that goes with building a program. And even though last year was tough, they had, 4 or 5 games of 8 or less along the way, and a couple that they probably could have won anyway, and just had a bad break here or there. So I think they've been really, really solid. And, you know, the scenario that played out here a couple of years ago with Kenny and the 21 team now, right? I mean, that was a terrific football team and won some big games. And I think that's kind of solidified their presence. And then, you know, I could go to some other sports too, but certainly what's transpired, I think the basketball stuff is now paid off with Jeff and things like that. It takes a while sometimes. When like NC State, Pitt, Wake Forest, you know, Pitt and Wake Forest in particular probably coming off tough years, but Dave Clawson and Pat Narduzzi have done the heavy lifting. They've done the heavy lifting to establish kind of what, and by the way, all the cards have changed, the ones you have to play in terms of football, like NIL portal, things like that. And yet I still think they've got, you know, solidarity and continuity in their program, which is really critical.
Going back to the playoff for a second, after seeing what happened to Florida State last year, getting left out of the field, should there be any anxiety among ACC schools thinking that could have been us, that could be us if we have a playoff-worthy resume, but there's not the respect there for the ACC?
Well, it won't happen to the champion, right? Because the champion's an automatic into the field. Where it could happen is, look, I think the league could get 3 or 4 in, okay? I think if you start to look at, let's take the front end of the preseason poll. Everybody at the front end of the preseason poll has a game or 2 along the way that's going to kind of determine how much they can stay in this. And if they lose, is it a loss they can recover from? When does the loss occur? Now, some of the old 14, you know, characteristics may still play out here, but I do believe in some respect the ACC has an advantage here because you're already kind of set with 4 or 5, maybe 6 teams that you kind of buy into, but 3 or 4 you feel really good about. And I think that's where that number is for me today. And after September, call me and I may tell you a different number. But Like their games in the month of September that are going to count. I mean, Miami plays one in week 1. NC State plays one in week 2. You know, Florida State's going to play one week 0. I mean, that's an interesting game for game 1 for Florida State and for Georgia Tech. But then Florida State turns around on October 5th and plays Clemson. NC State and Clemson play in late September. You start to see kind of where those markers are, right? And at 0-1, how many of those teams can you get to November? I think is a really interesting piece. And that's where Pitt has a chance. If they take care of those first 4, get the bye week, go to Chapel Hill, all of a sudden now you're looking at that team completely different than you would be had they gone 2-2. I'm trying to remember the start last year. Was it 1-3? Yeah. So that really does impact, and that's where you're talking about somebody who right now is being projected below the midline. And look, I wouldn't second guess if they go 4-0 out of here, they're going to be in the mix. That's just the way I think it plays out for schools like Pitt.
You spoke about quarterback continuity here at Pitt. I mean, what did you make of Nate Yarnell and Eli Holstein?
I think it's an interesting battle. I see positive with both guys. Yarnell obviously has got the experience of being here. The guys in the locker room know him. They're familiar with kind of the way he handles a game week. And, you know, I remember, was it Western Michigan a couple of years ago where he went and got the road win and wasn't sure he was going to play and ends up being the guy and goes up there and they find a way to get, Abanikanda went and had a big game, and Yarnell was kind of a terrific game manager. And I think really last year, the step back with, you know, all the uncertainty at quarterback probably impacted the way the season started for sure. Holstein, I mean, in watching the spring game, it was funny because the first play is him cutting a ball loose down the field. It's like, here's Cade Bell, here's the offense, and bang, right? And so I think that's going to be interesting because he really does some nice things too. This is a terrific decision, though. I mean, you look around the league, we've got 3 or 4 schools that are in this boat, but this is, I mean, others I think are window dressing in some respect for the competition. We know the heavy favorite is, but here, I just said on the show that later tonight, can you wait till a week out? You know, EJ Manuel thinks you got to give him 2 weeks. Roddy and I are kind of in that 7 to 10 day window. I'll be really interested to see what Coach Bell and Coach Narduzzi elect to do, because I think it will go through. I think there's another scrimmage, I was told, before they kind of start to think about their prep for Kent. You know, when are they willing to pull the trigger on who the starter is? Or are they going to go with my friend Mark Packer and just, you know, guess it all the way till the first snap?
Looking at this offense, from maybe what you've seen, from what you've heard, how do you think this new installment can match up against ACC defenses?
Are people ready for this here?
They weren't 10 years ago.
Cade is I don't know how deep you guys go back, and like, you know, the geek in me here of watching tape and YouTube rabbit holes is going to come out a little bit. I knew what Kerwin had done at Valdosta State. And I knew that Valdosta State was influenced by a lot of different people. But Cade now has influences not just from Kerwin, who was a terrific coach and a terrific offensive mind. And remember that, you know, Kerwin played in those, you know, Florida days where they were breaking ground with the way they threw the ball. So Cade has taken all of that and now expanded it. And I mean, you can tell by the lineups and the formations and the brief bit we've been able to watch the last couple of days that there's some NFL influence in this. Like for me, the most interesting player on the field is not any of the running backs or any of the wide receivers, it's Gavin Bartholomew. Because if I'm Cade Bell, I know he's a weapon with the football. And, you know, the one thing you can't question about Bartholomew is his athleticism and his toughness. And I think he is a fascinating part of what they can become. Now, Mumpfield's going to be great. Lee, the sincere Lee, CJ Lee, I guess, the kid that came from Western, obviously is a proven commodity. Reed is a proven commodity. You know what, when healthy, Hammond can be. But to me, Bartholomew is a guy that the way this kind of looks and the way it kind of fits, you know, Bell likes toys, and he's got toys here. And I think the real challenge, it's a twofold thing. The real challenge is, and I thought Ryan Jacoby and Terrence Moore, who were on the show tonight, were really reflective with Roddy yesterday in a piece we ran, a piece we taped about, you know, their transition here. And Pat talked about, you know, how much the strength and conditioning program has affected, you know, how these kids are going to be in shape. The second part for me, and EJ brought this up, you can go fast, you want to run a lot of plays, but it's also complementary to the defense. And how does that fit? So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch it happen. And again, I'll go back to those first 4 games. You're going to go, clearly you're going to see 2 Big 12 teams in the middle of that 4-game stretch. That feels like to me, how much continuity, how much rhythm do you have, how much stability in your depth chart, if you stayed away from some big injuries. Remember the West Virginia game last year, they lost, 2 starters, I think, in the game that night. That becomes, you got to stay away from that. That's the one thing that can sidetrack anybody, whether they're a good team or a great team.
Who's caught your eye on defense?
Well, the veteran guys in the back. P.J. O'Brien always catches my eye when I watch Pitt practice. McIntyre, McMillan, I think Brandon George is a nice fit. He's a guy in my book who I've watched play a lot, and I remember calling his name in a lot of broadcasts. But you also find a Brandon George as a guy now who has to not only be that guy, but he's got to be a leader. And that side has been so well led here the last handful of years. I mean, Servassier Dennis to me was just terrific. Kalijah Cansey was more of a quiet leader. I mean, they just had some really, really talented defensive guys here. But it feels like in talking to Brandon briefly that he knows this is his time. And he's old enough to probably be able to control the locker room and the respect level from his play, as well as what he says verbally. And I think that's a secret to anybody's team.
All good?
Anybody else? Great Sean Kemp sweatshirt, by the way.
Thank you.
Holy cow.